The night sky above occupied Europe was a strange, cold battlefield. At 20,000 feet, in the ink-black air over the Ruhr, a Royal Air Force Lancaster bomber drifted through the darkness, its 4 Merlin engines droning in perfect mechanical rhythm. Inside, 6 men lived by dim red light, their faces half-lit and hollow with exhaustion. They had been airborne for nearly 4 hours, and every one of them knew that somewhere in the blackness behind them, unseen and patient, a German night fighter was hunting. It was the winter of 1943. The Allied bombing campaign had reached a fevered pitch. Each night, the Royal Air Force sent hundreds of heavy bombers into German airspace toward the flak-filled skies over Berlin, Essen or Kassel. And each night, dozens failed to return. To the men who flew these missions, the unseen enemy behind them had become something mythical. They called it simply the night fighter. It had no face, no voice, only the brief, stabbing flash of cannon fire in the dark, the sudden eruption of flame that marked the end of another crew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In Lancaster DS 739 of No. 101 Squadron, the rear gunner, Sergeant Harold Brooks, sat hunched in his turret, surrounded by frost and vibration. He could feel his own heartbeat against the trigger grips of his twin. 303 Brownings. His world was a tiny glass sphere suspended in endless blackness. Somewhere out there, he knew, a Messerschmitt Bf 110 or a Junkers Ju 88 was weaving silently through the night, guided by radar, its pilot invisible and calm, his instruments glowing faintly green. Brooks had been briefed before takeoff that the Germans were using a new device, the Liechtenstein radar. It allowed them to home in on the faint electronic emissions from the bomber's navigation systems. The RAF crews had no such luxury. They could only guess, listening to the hum of their engines, scanning the void for a flicker of movement. For months, they had been dying this way ambushed, invisible to their killers until the moment cannon shells tore through their fuselage. But on that January night in 1943, Brooks carried something new, a small, box-shaped device mounted just beneath his turret. It had been fitted only days before at RAF Ludford Magna. The engineers called it Monica, after a signalman's daughter. Officially, it was known as the Tail Warning Radar, Type 79B. Its promise was simple, to tell bomber crews when a night fighter was approaching from behind. For the first time, they would have eyes in the dark. At exactly 2:17 hours, a tiny green light flickered on Brooks's panel. The indicator needle trembled, then steadied at the 1,000-yard mark. "Contact, astern," Brooks muttered into his intercom. His voice was steady, but his stomach tightened. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Alan Foster, immediately began a gentle corkscrew maneuver, throttling back one engine and banking hard to port. The rest of the crew tensed. In the black sky behind them, nothing could be seen but the Monica receiver hummed softly, a ghostly pulse that marked the presence of death. Brooks squinted into his sight, his breath fogging the glass. Then, faintly, he saw it a dark shape, lower, closing fast. The German was there. He squeezed the trigger, his twin Brownings rattling into life. The Lancaster shuddered as Foster dove sharply, the night outside erupting into tracers and confusion. The enemy overshot, flashing past their port side. For the first time in months, the hunted had seen the hunter first. The system worked. That night, Monica saved them. The Lancaster limped home with holes in its tailplane and a wounded navigator, but it landed safely at Ludford Magna just before dawn. The airfield lights looked like jewels against the black earth. Brooks climbed out of his turret with frozen hands, his face grey with exhaustion, and said only 4 words to the waiting ground crew. "The bloody thing works." To the men of Bomber Command, Monica was a miracle. Word spread quickly through the squadrons finally, a device that could sense death before it struck. For the first time, crews began to feel a sliver of control over the invisible threat that had haunted them for so long. The Air Ministry immediately ordered hundreds of units produced. By the spring of 1944, Nearly every Lancaster and Halifax bomber carried one. But the victory would not last. What the crews could not know, and what British intelligence would not discover for months, was that their miracle warning device was about to become a beacon, one that would betray them to the very predators it was meant to repel. To understand how that terrible irony unfolded, we must first understand the war of invisibility that unfolded between the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe above Europe, a war fought not with bullets and bombs, but with waves, frequencies, and the ghostly pulse of radar. In the early years of the war, the night sky over Germany was a vast black arena of chance. Before radar matured, interception was largely guesswork. The Germans called it Himmelbett, the canopy bed. It was an elaborate system of ground-based radar and searchlights designed to guide night fighters into contact with enemy bombers. Crews of Bf 110 seconds and Ju 88 seconds would patrol assigned boxes, waiting for ground controllers to vector them toward an incoming stream of bombers. The controllers used radar plots from the Freya and Würzburg systems to place both hunter and prey on the same patch of sky. Then, at the crucial moment, massive searchlights would bloom across the clouds, trapping bombers in cones of light as the fighters pounced. For a time, it worked brutally well. In 1941 and 42, British losses during deep penetration night raids were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe's Nachtjagdgeschwader units' night fighter wings grew increasingly skilled, and their tactics increasingly lethal. Crews like Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufers or Helmut Lentz became legends among German airmen. Their kills mounted into the dozens. Entire squadrons of Lancasters vanished in flame during a single night's raid. To counter this, British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, the same group that had pioneered radar before the Battle of Britain, began an electronic arms race. They developed window, known to the Americans as chaff, the simple but devastating technique of dropping thin strips of aluminum foil from bombers to confuse radar operators. The first operational use of window during the Hamburg raid of July 1943 caused chaos among the German defences. Radar screens bloomed with false echoes. The night fighters were blinded, the Himmelbett boxes rendered useless. It was the beginning of a new kind of war, one fought in invisible wavelengths. Yet even as the British rejoiced at their ingenuity, the Germans adapted. They fitted their night fighters with Liechtenstein SN-2 radar, an airborne set that operated on lower frequencies unaffected by window. With it, they could hunt independently, without ground control, homing in on bombers by their radar and radio emissions. The hunters had evolved. It was in this shifting electronic battlefield that Monica was born. Developed in late 1942 at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, the Type 79B tail warning radar was intended to give bomber crews early warning of a pursuing fighter within a range of about 1,500 yards. It worked by transmitting a continuous signal to the rear and receiving any reflections from nearby aircraft. A simple cathode ray tube in the gunner's compartment displayed the distance to the approaching object as a glowing blip and audible tone. To the men who used it, the science barely mattered. What mattered was survival, and in the months after Monica's introduction, Bomber Command's morale rose noticeably. Crews reported more evasive maneuvers, more successful returns, fewer losses. Squadron reports filled with cautious optimism. At last, one pilot wrote in his logbook, "We have something that looks behind us, but optimism in war is always paid for in time." By the late autumn of 1943, the men of Bomber Command had begun to speak of Monica with something like reverence. It was small, almost laughably so, a metal box the size of a bread loaf, wired through the fuselage to a whip antenna that pointed aft into the night. Yet to the exhausted crews who climbed aboard their Lancasters and Halifaxes night after night, that small green flicker of its display meant the difference between terror and reprieve. Crews wrote its name in chalk on the fuselage before takeoff. Some rear gunners whispered a prayer to it as they swung into their turrets. There were even stories, half joke, half superstition, that Monica could smell a night fighter before a man could see it. Ground crews, too, placed faith in it. "If they've got Monica," one fitter remarked at Waddington, "at least they've got a chance." But in war, chance is rarely kind for long. The Luftwaffe, battered but unbroken, was already probing for the weakness behind this new British confidence. In late 1943, at the Luftnachrichteninspektion 4, the Luftwaffe's radio and radar technical section headquartered near Berlin engineers began recovering fragments from crashed bombers. Among the twisted wreckage of one downed Lancaster outside Cologne, they discovered a compact radar transmitter with the stenciled letters R, A, F, Type 79, B. To the German scientists, the implication was immediately clear. The British had developed a tail-mounted radar of their own, Oberst. Hans Panse, a specialist in radar countermeasures, described the find in his post-war interrogations. It was not difficult to determine its function, he recalled. The device operated on a frequency near 300 MHz. It was active, always transmitting. Such signals, we realized, could be detected. Within weeks, the team at the Rechlin Test Center had built a crude receiver capable of picking up Monica's emissions. It was a simple idea, born of a brutal logic. If the British bombers were broadcasting radar pulses behind them, then those pulses could guide the hunters straight to their prey. By the spring of 1944, this concept had matured into an operational system codenamed Flensburg, named, with grim irony, after a quiet German town near the Danish border. The Fug 227 Flensburg receiver was soon being fitted to the night fighters of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1 and NJG 3. Its principle was chillingly elegant. The more a bomber relied on its Monica tail-warning radar, the more strongly it illuminated itself on the Luftwaffe's instruments. The very pulse meant to warn of danger became a beacon for it. At first, no one in Bomber Command suspected. Crews reported that night fighters seemed to find them even in total radio silence, even when they flew new routes or altitudes. Losses crept upward again, eroding the fragile sense of control the Monica device had given them. Some crews, unnerved, began to switch it off once over enemy territory, but others trusted it implicitly, believing any malfunction or unexplained silence was more dangerous still. In May of 1944, Flight Lieutenant Edward Ted Chambers of 626 Squadron recorded a curious observation in his logbook after a raid on Brunswick. Enemy aircraft seemed to approach directly from astern. Monica gave no warning. Feels as though they know precisely where we are. Chambers' note went unnoticed, but at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, where scientists were already testing new countermeasures, a few engineers began to suspect something was wrong. They knew Monica transmitted a continuous signal on a wavelength around 9 centimeters strong enough to be detected by any sensitive receiver tuned to it. The question was whether the Germans had realized it. They had, and they were already hunting by it. One of the first to exploit Flensburg with lethal effect was Oberleutnant Ludwig Meister of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1. Meister's Bf 110 G4 carried both Liechtenstein SN2 radar and the new Flensburg receiver. On the night of April 24, 1944, he intercepted a Lancaster stream returning from Munich. He later told an interrogator after the war, "We saw nothing at all, just the needle on the Flensburg creeping higher as we turned. At about 4 kilometers it was strong enough to home by. We closed slowly, and the target appeared ahead, black against the stars." The gunner never fired. We had been listening to his Monica for 20 minutes. That single line, listening to his Monica, would come to define one of the cruelest ironies in the history of electronic warfare. Through the summer of 1944, the night skies again became a slaughterhouse. Entire bomber streams disappeared in sheets of flame over the Rhine. Crews reported night fighters appearing as if from nowhere. At 101 Squadron, which flew specially equipped Lancasters for electronic warfare, one veteran gunner wrote bitterly, "They're finding us faster than ever. It's as though the bastards have a map of our tails." The truth finally broke open not through British ingenuity, but by the chance of war. In early July of 1944, a Ju-88 G1 night fighter of NJG-2, flown by Oberleutnant Friedrich Eberle, was forced to land at RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk after its crew became disoriented in fog while returning from a mission. When RAF intelligence officers inspected the aircraft, they found a complex array of antennas and, mounted behind the radar operator's seat, a small receiver marked Fug 227 Flensburg. Technical officers from the Telecommunications Research Establishment immediately realized what it was. A captured German document found later described it succinctly: Flensburg passive receiver for detection of emissions from English Monica tail warning radar. Range approximately 15 kilometers. The discovery caused an immediate, silent panic. Orders went out that all Monica sets were to be switched off at once. Within 48 hours, the system that had once symbolized hope was banned entirely. Ground crews at airfields across England removed the sets under strict secrecy. Official communiques avoided mentioning the reason, citing only equipment rationalization. The real explanation was whispered among air crews with growing disbelief. The Germans were homing on Monica. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the officers' mess at Ludford Magna, Harold Brooks, now a flight sergeant with 26 operations behind him, listened as his commanding officer read the order aloud. The men stared at one another in silence. For over a year, they had trusted that tiny green light had lived because of it, or so they'd believed. Now they learned it had been guiding their killers all along. I felt sick, Brooks later told a BBC interviewer in 1988. It was as though someone had told us our guardian angel had been working for the other side. The RAF's withdrawal of Monica in the summer of 1944 marked the end of a chapter in the invisible war between detection and deception. In its place, new systems emerged: Fishpond, a downward-looking radar based on the H2S navigation system, and improved rearward scanning devices that operated on far shorter wavelengths. But the damage to trust was done. Crews were slower to believe in new technologies. Many simply preferred their own eyes, their own instincts, over the soft, treacherous hum of a machine. For the Luftwaffe's night fighters, the advantage granted by Flensburg was short-lived. Within weeks of the Woodbridge incident, British jamming rendered it useless. Yet by then, the balance of the air war had already shifted irreversibly. The Allies were advancing through France, their air superiority overwhelming by day and by night. The once lethal Nachtjagd force was exhausted, its pilots stretched thin, its bases overrun. But the story of Monica lingered in the minds of those who had trusted it, a quiet reminder that in modern war, every miracle comes with a cost. When Harold Brooks flew his final operation over the shattered remnants of Berlin in April 1945, he did so in a Lancaster stripped of every unnecessary device. The stub of the old Monica aerial was still there, capped with tape. As they crossed the Dutch coast, the navigator remarked that the set's absence made the cabin eerily quiet. Brooks, sitting once more in his turret, said nothing. He was staring into the same darkness he had always known, but this time there were no comforting green flickers, no phantom guardians. Only silence and the long memory of what it had meant to believe in safety. In the end, Monica was both triumph and tragedy, a machine born of desperate ingenuity, undone by its own brilliance. It taught airmen and scientists alike that in the invisible realm of electronic warfare, knowledge was never permanent, and safety was always fleeting. Every pulse sent into the void invited another pulse back. Every signal of warning risked becoming a signal of invitation. And for the men who flew through those black, frozen nights over Europe, the lesson was written not in theory, but in flame in the lonely arcs of burning bombers falling through the dark, betrayed by the very light that was meant to save them. Dawn came late to eastern England in those last months of the war. The airfields along the Lincolnshire wolds woke beneath low clouds and the thin whine of starter motors. Frost glazed the dispersal tracks, and crews moved slowly, like men twice their age. The campaign against Germany's cities had become routine, mechanical, and terrible. Each night the bombers rose, and each morning the count began again. The names scrawled on the blackboard changed almost daily. By early 1945, Bomber Command was no longer the blunt instrument it had been in the dark years of 1942 and -3. It had become an enormous, disciplined machine of destruction, 44 squadrons of Lancasters and Halifaxes operating with mathematical precision. Its commanders, Sir Arthur Harris foremost among them, believed that the campaign's relentless pressure was finally breaking the enemy's capacity to resist. Yet for the men who flew the missions, the sense of triumph was tempered by exhaustion and by memory. They had learned that every advantage, no matter how ingenious, carried within it the seeds of betrayal. The lesson of Monica hung unspoken in every briefing room. The aerial stub that once jutted from each tail cone had been sawn off or capped with resin, but its ghost remained. Aircrew joked bitterly about singing to Jerry, the old phrase for emitting signals. When the new fishpond radar sets were introduced, clever, downward-looking devices integrated into the H-2S navigation radar, many gunners hesitated to trust them. They listened politely as the instructors explained range, coverage, and operating frequency, then exchanged weary glances. "We've heard that tune before," someone would mutter. The scientists at the telecommunications research establishment understood the mistrust. Several had visited bomber stations in late 1944, standing awkwardly among crews, who eyed them as if they were gamblers asking for another stake. One physicist, Dr. Joan Curran, the same woman who had invented window, recorded in her diary, "They are courteous but tired. Every new device we offer must now prove itself against the ghosts of the old ones." The invisible war between emission and detection had grown more complex than even the most gifted of those scientists had imagined in 1939. By 1945, radar had become the heartbeat of modern conflict. Ground control, navigation, gun laying, proximity fuses, and countermeasures layered in dizzying succession. What had begun as a secret edge in the Battle of Britain had matured into an entire universe of electronic struggle. In that universe, Monica was remembered as the first great cautionary tale. To the German night fighter crews who had exploited her signal, the experience had been equally transformative. Interviews conducted after the surrender revealed a curious ambivalence. Major Schnaufer, the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring night ace, described Flensburg as useful but short-lived, one more fleeting trick in a war of mirrors. He admitted that after the Woodbridge incident, confidence in all German detection gear faltered. "We realized," he told his British interrogator, "that each time we switched on a transmitter, the English were probably listening. We were hunters who might also be bait." His remark could have been engraved on the tombstone of 20th-century electronic warfare. In the shattered cities below, civilians knew nothing of these invisible duels. To them the war was light and sound, searchlights clawing at the clouds, the distant thump of flak, the long tremor of bomb loads falling through the night. The men of the Nachtjagd and the crews of Bomber Command alike inhabited a private realm, unseen by the people whose fate they decided. For both, survival depended on trust in unseen instruments. When those instruments lied or worse, betrayed, the psychological wound ran deep. Harold Brooks returned to civilian life in the spring of 1946. He was 23 years old and looked 35. Like thousands of others, he found himself back among people who could not imagine what the war had required. In his village in Nottinghamshire, neighbours asked polite questions about the flying life. He answered vaguely, unwilling to describe the claustrophobia of the turret or the smell of cordite and glycol. Yet one story he told repeatedly, almost ritualistically, concerned the night Monica saved them, the first time the green light flickered and he fired into darkness. He never mentioned the later discovery that the device had betrayed others. When asked why, he said only, "Because for one night, I told the truth." That paradox, the idea that something could be both savior and traitor, became the moral undertone of the post-war reflection on radar warfare. The official historians at the Air Ministry wrote cautious accounts, heavy with technical appendices, noting that Monica was withdrawn due to the enemy's interception of its transmissions. The phrase sounded antiseptic, almost bureaucratic. The airmen knew it meant that hundreds of crews had likely died because of it. But in the culture of 1945, where stoicism was expected and grief was private, few spoke of blame. they simply turned the page and flew on. In Germany, the engineers who had built Flensburg faced their own reckoning. Many were absorbed into Allied research programs, their knowledge too valuable to discard. The Cold War was beginning, and the lessons of electronic vulnerability were suddenly of global interest. American and British laboratories quietly studied the Monika Flensburg episode as a case study in emission control. From those reports emerged one of the cardinal rules of modern warfare. Every transmitter is a target. Decades later, the principle would govern everything from submarine communications to stealth aircraft design. In a sense, the ghost of Monika still haunts the skies. For the veterans of Bomber Command, memory settled in fragments. Reunions in the 1960s and 70s were filled with anecdotes, some humorous, some darkly ironic. At one gathering in Lincoln, a former wireless operator produced a Monika indicator he had kept since the war. He placed it on the bar. Its dial still marked range in yards. The men laughed, and someone tapped the glass and said, "She still looks innocent." They all understood what he meant. Historians who later examined the operational records found that the number of bombers lost during the period when Flensburg was active, roughly February to July 1944, was indeed higher than expected, though exact attribution was impossible. Statistical models suggested that as many as 600 aircraft might have been intercepted directly through Monika emissions. Each of those aircraft carried 7 men. The mathematics of irony was merciless. The removal of the device did not end losses, but it shifted their nature. The night fighters continued to claim victims, yet never again with the same uncanny precision. The British scientists, analysing post-July data, noted the pattern quietly and moved on to the next challenge, countering the new German radar Naxos, which homed on the British H-2S ground mapping radar. The duel continued, one echo chasing another. When peace finally came, and Europe exhaled after 6 years of strain, the vast electronic architecture of the air war began to dissolve. Antenna masts were dismantled, laboratories emptied, classified documents locked away. The physical relics of Monika, the little black boxes and whip aerials, were scrapped or sold for surplus. Only a few survived in museums, their labels faded, their significance seldom explained to visitors who passed them on the way to more glamorous artifacts. The Spitfire, the Lancaster, the Enigma machine. Yet in the quiet of archives and in the memories of those who had relied on it, Monika endured as a symbol of the strange intimacy between man and machine that modern war had created. In 1983, the Imperial War Museum in London recorded an oral history session with several surviving members of 101 Squadron. The interviewer, a young historian, asked whether they felt betrayed by the scientists who had designed Monika. The responses were measured. One gunner said, "No, they did their best, same as we did. We were all guessing in the dark." Another added, "It was never about blame. It was about learning fast enough to stay alive." Their words carried the calm of men who had long since made peace with uncertainty. That uncertainty, what could be seen, what could be known, defined the psychological texture of the bomber war. Crews lived by instruments, altimeters, gyro compasses, airspeed indicators, radio bearings, radar scopes. Each device was a promise that knowledge could replace fear. When that promise failed, it was not only faith in technology that cracked, but faith in the idea of control itself. Monika's betrayal was therefore not merely technical, it was existential. It reminded every airman that the universe of information could invert without warning, that what saved today might condemn tomorrow. Modern readers, accustomed to satellite guidance and encrypted data links, may find such faith and such disillusionment quaint. But the men of 1943 had no precedents. They were inventing the rules as they fought, discovering through blood and mathematics the boundaries of an invisible frontier. Their mistakes became the textbooks of a new age. In the years that followed, veterans occasionally received letters from researchers or students asking for recollections of radar use. Harold Brooks replied to one such inquiry in 1992. His handwritten answer, now preserved in a museum file, ends with a paragraph that could serve as an epitaph for the whole story. People think of war as noise and fire. For us, it was often waiting in silence for a dot of light to move. That dot could mean death or safety, sometimes both at once. The machines didn't deceive us on purpose, they were as blind as we were. But they taught us humility, which is perhaps the only wisdom a survivor can claim. By then, he was an old man living by the sea, walking each morning along the cliffs where radar stations had once stood. He said he could still hear, in certain winds, the faint pulse of transmitters long dismantled. "It's only the tide," he would tell his grandchildren, smiling, "but it sounds like Monica calling home." The irony of the device's name did not escape later commentators. Monica, a domestic, almost affectionate word, evoked the world of safety and family that the bomber crews had left behind. Its betrayal thus carried a symbolic resonance, the comforting voice that lured one to ruin. Poets of the war generation touched on the theme indirectly, the notion that technology, like love, could be faithless yet indispensable. The historian Basil Collier wrote that the electronic war was fought between two blind men striking with torches. Whichever first felt the heat was already aflame. Monica had been such a torch. As aviation entered the jet age, radar warning systems returned more sophisticated, encrypted, directional. Pilots in Korea and Vietnam relied on them as instinctively as their predecessors had once relied on the Type 79B. Yet in training lectures on electronic emissions, instructors often cited the old British device as a parable. "Remember Monica," they would say. "Every friendly signal is an invitation to the enemy." Few of the young airmen knew what the name referred to, but the caution remained. If one seeks meaning in the long arc from 1943 to the present, it lies in that delicate balance between trust and skepticism. The Monica story reveals not only the speed of technological evolution, but the enduring constancy of human vulnerability. Behind every radar screen sits a person who must decide whether to believe what it shows. No algorithm can remove that moment of faith. In the final analysis, the tragedy of Monica was not that it failed, but that it succeeded too well in giving comfort. It answered a primal need to know when danger approached from behind. That need still defines the psychology of combat. The fear of unseen pursuit. The engineers who built it understood the physics of reflection and signal strength, but they could not calculate the human desire to believe that safety could be engineered. When the green light glowed, men felt less alone. In war, that feeling is worth almost anything, even risk. The Lancaster bombers that survive in museums today often display restored turrets, shining brass gun sights, and immaculate camouflage. Rarely is the small Monica aerial reattached. Curators sometimes omit it to preserve the aircraft's cleaner lines. Yet those who know point to the small mount beneath the tail and say quietly, "That's where she was." It is a modest memorial to the invisible war, the one fought in the air between trust and betrayal, silence and signal. On the night of May 8, 1945, as news of Germany's surrender spread across Europe, the squadrons of Bomber Command stood down. Engines fell silent, and for the first time in years the blackout curtains were drawn aside. The men stepped into daylight that felt unreal. Among the crowd at Ludford Magna, Harold Brooks watched technicians remove the last classified instruments from his aircraft. Someone asked whether he wanted a souvenir. He shook his head. "We've carried enough ghosts," he said. Decades later, when veterans gathered for commemorations, they spoke less of raids and more of comradeship, the shared nights, the sound of engines in cloud, the faint warmth of the turret heater failing at altitude. One evening, after a memorial service, a younger historian asked Brooks what lesson the war had given him. He thought for a long moment, then answered, "That knowledge is never certain, and that courage begins where certainty ends." In those few words, the long history of Monica found its human meaning. The device's technical story, its frequencies, its circuits, its fatal emissions, was only the surface of a deeper narrative. The perpetual human attempt to see into darkness, and the equally perpetual discovery that the darkness looks back. The night sky above Europe is quiet now. The routes, once known as bomber streams, are crossed only by airliners tracing their luminous arcs across the stratosphere. Somewhere below, in old fields where dispersal tracks crumble into grass, fragments of aerial wire still lie buried. If one were to dig there and find a corroded connector marked Type 79B, it would seem an insignificant relic. Yet in that bit of metal rests the memory of thousands who trusted the unseen, who believed that sound and mathematics could guard them against fear, and who learned, through fire and silence, that even a warning can become an invitation. The story of Monica ends not in accusation, but in remembrance. It reminds us that progress is written in paradox, that every step toward safety opens a new path to peril, and that courage consists not in the absence of fear, but in flying onward despite it. For the men of Bomber Command, courage was measured in hours of darkness, in faith placed upon a flickering light. And though that light betrayed them, it also kept them company in the loneliest sky mankind had yet known. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.